I understand that this won't be anonymous. I did have a question about how you're envisioning presenting this data.
Right. So basically what we plan to do is compile all of the interviews and then organize them thematically and share the information that way. We've talked about doing a book. We're not entirely sure that we're going to have enough robust data to do that. It depends on how many interviews we end up getting. It could be in the form of a white paper. I don't know if we will distribute that through the working group or not. I'm self-funding a lot of this actually, so helping to offset the transcriptions that aren't covered. I could also see doing some kind of a presentation for the working group, not unlike we've seen before in those sort of larger settings that would actually, I feel like, support some of the quantitative data that's already been collected about how researchers are handling things, but this just going into a little bit more detail.
Okay, that sounds good. I figured that might be, the case, at least in terms of presentation format, but I wasn't. That's interesting to hear that you're considering a book or even a white paper, a write-up in that sense. I think you're right.
Yeah, and I think some of it will have to do with the level of interest in the working group proper, just sort of trying to figure out exactly who wants to play what roles. Those things, as you well know, change over time. You commit to something and then all of a sudden you have like a new job or something and things change, but I'm hoping that it'll be useful information. And I know there was some effort to do this after Katrina that didn't really come to fruition. That we can do a better job with that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I don't have any other questions other than that. Thank you for sending the interview guide in advance. That was helpful just to get me thinking about some things that I really hadn't. That I love being asked the question, for example, about what shaped my thinking about disaster research. I'm like, it's nice to reflect on that and really think about it. So I appreciated the question.
Excellent. Well, to start, would you go ahead and say your name and your affiliation?
Yes, my name is Jamie Vickery, and I'm a research associate at the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the National Center for Atmospheric Research.
Right. And would you tell me a little bit about your professional background?
Yes, so when I looked at this question, Lisa will tell me if I'm getting too far off the mark here, but I was just going to start briefly with my educational background and then move into the day. So I don't know if it's too far back, but I received my undergraduate degree from Oklahoma State University in political science with a minor in emergency management, because at that time I knew I wanted to do something in the realm of disaster studies, but I wasn't sure at that time if I was wanting to be more into the practitioner space, emergency management, or continue on in doing research in this field. So that's a bit of my background, and then I decided based on that and conversations with folks at Oklahoma State, I decided to apply to the CU Sociology program because of the Natural Hazard Center, and at the time, the people who were involved at the center, including yourself and Kathleen. And so that's really what led me to graduate studies, but I always knew professionally that I wanted to work on issues related to at-risk or vulnerable populations, those populations that are known to be more at risk before, during, after disasters.
So approximately when was it that you got involved with research on disasters?
That started, I did secondary analysis in my undergraduate thesis on altruism after disasters, and that was in 2011 and 2012, but really when I started doing data collection, that didn't occur until I was at the Hazard Center, and my time at the Hazard Center started in the summer of 2013.
So I know the answer to this question, but others don't. Is there a single seminal disaster that shaped your thinking about disaster research?
Yeah, I had fun thinking through this question. So I kind of framed it two different ways. One was what events really interested me, really got me interested in understanding why disasters occur the way they do, why there's disproportionate impacts. And really, that happened for me after the 1999 tornadoes that hit Oklahoma, the May 1999 tornadoes. And obviously, having grown up in Oklahoma City, I was at an early age exposed to the bombing that occurred, and so these events were really seminal for me and my thinking about what I felt that I wanted to do with my career, and helping people some way or another. At that time, I couldn't really verbalize it, but helping people during these extreme events, and what kind of role can I play in that sense. So that really that really got me interested in this space. And then it wasn't until, I mean, this is probably the same for many people, but I was in high school when Hurricane Katrina struck. And for me, that was the first time I started to come to the realization that disasters aren't these great equalizing events. Even at that time, I think I was a sophomore in high school, that's when I realized that there are processes, there are things at play that make people more affected, more heavily affected by disasters over other groups. And why is that? And I was always interested in understanding the why and what I could do to alleviate that. So I would say that for me was a seminal event, and thinking about disasters more than them being, oh, these terrible events that happen, but that they in fact, they're socially created. So that for me was pretty important in my career trajectory.
Mm-hmm. So thinking about COVID-19 at this point, what was the focus of your research before the pandemic? Did you have a particular study that you were engaged with?
Mm-hmm. I was engaged, I'm still engaged in 2 studies based on the 2 positions that I hold, and one of them had to do with an evaluation of Save the Children's building capacities programs for state-level voluntary organizations active in disasters. And very briefly, that study, that evaluation is exploring the proof of concept behind this training model for them to figure out how to create state-level indicators for VOAD, for integrating children's needs at the VOAD level, for preparing for children's needs before, during, and after disaster. And that's a very glossed over overview of it. So I was engaged in that in Arkansas and Nebraska specifically, without those state-level VOADs. And then at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, I'm still engaged in work around an evaluation of the Tropical Cyclone Product Suite created by the National Weather Service. And so I was engaged right before COVID, really, really before March, when I was engaged in field work. I was interviewing emergency managers and broadcast meteorologists to understand their information needs leading up to a tropical cyclone threat, and how they use the products put forward by the National Weather Service, what could be improved. So really it's just an in-depth, it's an evaluation comprehensively of the tropical cyclone product suite. And sorry, I don't want to get ahead. Did you ask me how it affected it as well?
Well, before we get there, could you talk a little bit about your dissertation research?
Oh, yes. My dissertation explored the experiences of people experiencing homelessness as well as homeless serving organizations in Boulder County during the 2013 floods that really affected large swaths of the Front Range in Colorado. So I was engaged in interviews with people experiencing homelessness, staff members at homeless serving organizations, as well as public officials at city and county levels within Boulder County. And so so I guess I'm paid to do with the Save the Children work and the work with the National Weather Service. That's what I'm paid to do for my particular positions at this point. But the research that I've always been interested in, although up until recently it hasn't been as active, has been on homeless communities, those who are precariously housed during disasters, broadly speaking.
So do I understand correctly that you're involved in the Converge working group in that space, that research space?
Yes, I lead the working group on homelessness, housing precarity, and COVID-19. And now that we are done with the research agenda, we had put that together. It was a team effort, of course. Now that we've submitted that, we are looking to establish a more formal network of scholars, practitioners, and other key stakeholders, an international network, I should say, so that we can, and we're formulating that right now. We actually had a meeting earlier this week about how we envision the role of this network beyond information sharing, and really trying to find ways that we can collaborate, and especially working with practitioners to answer questions that they have. So that we're still in the works with that, but we're planning our next meeting in a couple of weeks with a larger group.
So is it fair to say that you are conducting research on that population, those populations associated with COVID-19, or is that something that's down the road once this network gets more established and perhaps you have some funding?
So in terms of data, in terms of interview data collection, that's something that we want to do, but we have not yet engaged. Right at this point, we're collecting secondary data. We're collecting media articles, information about policy, responses to COVID-19 specific to homeless communities and precariously housed populations. So we've started doing some legwork on that front, and the next step will be to analyze this data and analyze it thematically. So we've started to do that, but really the next step would be to, depending on who is interested in being involved in conducting a research project with practitioners and other scholars from different contexts outside of the U.S. context, to engage in this kind of work. But that's all, yeah, it's still in progress, and the scope of that work and what our specific questions would be. But it would definitely build on the research agenda that we put together.
So what would you say once you are in a position to analyze these data and then perhaps collect additional data are the goals associated with the work that you are interested in?
Mm-hmm. Well, I know I'm not just speaking for myself, but I'll frame it as, although I'm speaking for myself, but this reflects the goals of the larger group. And most importantly, we want to make sure that the work that we are doing is useful to those on the ground, for practitioners, for policymakers, for people who are living with, who are currently experiencing homelessness or who are precariously housed. So while it's important for us to engage in theoretically meaningful work, really our priorities lie with making sure that our work is first and foremost not exploitative, and that we're engaging with communities in a respectful way that really answers the questions that they have. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but that's the most important outcome of this work, is that it is applicable and useful to people on the ground.
What do you see as some of the formats for disseminating your findings and the analyses?
Mm-hmm. So we started talking about that actually during our meeting earlier this week, and we have a few ideas. We want to disseminate information that we've gleaned from these secondary data, for example, the secondary data analysis through media articles and policy. We want to disseminate that in a digestible way. So whether that's in the form of infographics, and it will likely be adapted depending on the context that we're disseminating this information out to. We also discussed doing webinar presentations and inviting practitioners and inviting other key stakeholders to participate as panelists. But really these would be in-depth discussions where we talk with various stakeholders about what we're seeing, learn from them and what they're experiencing on the ground. And it's also important to mention that since we have practitioners as part of our working group, that affords us invaluable insights and really helps us to think of how we can disseminate this information in a way that's meaningful and not in a way that it's going to be put on a shelf, so to speak. Mm-hmm. That's been incredibly valuable to have their input throughout, from the very beginning, about how we can engage these individuals. And really what's been most effective throughout and up until this point has been having those conversations with them, having these meetings and making space for them to share their perspectives, their updates and insights. So I envision that at least at this point, that's how we would disseminate information, is in that conversational way, but also thinking through what would be the most effective way. Maybe it's a 2-pager or very high-level executive summary where we could provide more detail as needed or as requested, but making sure that it's not a daunting load of information that we hand them a 40-page PDF, making sure that it's appropriate.
How many people are in the working group?
So let's see, we have almost 40 members, but in terms of active members, people who are involved in putting together the research agenda, around 25. And that's about the same number that's wanting to carry forward as a more formal network. Although one of our first agenda items as a network is to engage with scholars and practitioners in different contexts outside of the U.S., because currently we're very heavily U.S. based in our makeup.
So what role has Converge played in your activities with the working group?
You know, it's interesting because before COVID, even before this became, you know, the issue that it is today, we had already had preliminary conversations. I'd had conversations with a few other scholars interested in homelessness and disaster work about setting up a disaster research network. And this Converge working group really, it came after those discussions. And so this was an opportunity for us to really to make the time to move forward in establishing a working group that could evolve into a network. So if anything, it really kind of lit, for lack of a better phrase, like lit the fire under our butts to, to get going and move forward on something that we've been talking about for several weeks. And when this opportunity came about, we were like, this is a way for our group to become more formalized. We could see who else is interested in being a part of this network. So this is a great way for us to get the word out about what we're interested in exploring and seeing who else is interested in how we can engage others, researchers and practitioners.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned earlier, you know, that it's important to be able to serve practitioners and their interest needs, but you also mentioned theories and concepts, essentially, that underlie the work that you do. What are some of those?
We realize, so at this point, given we've created a framework, a set of frameworks actually as part of our working group, and that was a really, really excellent, useful exercise, especially given that we do have a group that engages practitioners, because they were involved in the development of these frameworks from the very beginning. And I'd be happy to share with you those frameworks. But really that came about in part, it was inspired by the pressure and release framework. That's what really got the conversation going about how homelessness is socially created and how, you know, in the context of how disasters are socially created. And so we were explaining that framework to practitioners, receiving their insights, and that led us to create this adapted framework of homelessness in the context of COVID-19. And so it's not a pre-established framework that we're going off of. We created this as a working group, a set of frameworks to not only understand the homelessness in the context of COVID-19, but ways forward, how COVID-19 is an opportunity for us to engage in work and engage in conversations with practitioners and policymakers to really just make this more of an opportunity that could be used to identify solutions for homelessness, even outside of a COVID-19 context.
Mm-hmm. So with respect to the research agenda that you all have set moving forward, the housing issues associated with the economic situation with COVID is getting worse every single day. Do you have a plan in your research agenda to incorporate that population, those people, in terms of how you are figuring how to move forward with your research?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. We've been pretty much every meeting we talk about the eviction crisis that was already underway before COVID-19, but it's unfortunately getting worse and worse by the day, especially as protections are lifted and people are put in more precarious housing situations. So we're definitely talking about these groups, and that's actually one of the reasons why we decided to change the name of our working group, because at first it was called Homelessness in COVID-19, and definitions, as you likely know, definitions of homelessness vary already. It's kind of a murky concept for some. And so we wanted to broaden the network to include housing precarity for that very reason, because there are people who are on the brink of homelessness. There's people who may have stable housing for a few months out of the year, who then now, especially who are seasonal workers, for example, or students. And we wanted to make sure that we captured those populations, and included within that are those who are on the brink of facing evictions. And so we've been following trends with the eviction crisis, not just in the United States, but more globally as well. And that's what is so critical about having international perspectives in our group, because I've learned so much about how not only the ways that people in various contexts think about homelessness and housing precarity and how it's defined, but the very unique socio-political issues that were already in existence before COVID-19 that led to precarious housing situations in different parts of the world. So yes, in short, we are including those populations as well.
So the new name of your working group is what?
Well, it was already established as the name, but it's homelessness, housing precarity, and COVID-19. And originally we didn't have housing precarity included in the title. That was adjusted after we were given the award for the working group.
Okay. You mentioned a little bit earlier about some of the methods that you're using for the project as it stands right now. Could you talk a little bit about those?
So we've been primarily at this point focusing on media analysis, media data collection around various news outlets, and we've had the help of wonderful graduate students who are interested in this, who are already engaged in this kind of work or had an interest in homelessness and disasters. And so we've been engaging them, and they've been helping us to categorize some of these media articles thematically. And so at this point, it's been a lot of just bringing in these articles and putting them in a spreadsheet. And so really the next step would be to dig deeper into some of the thematic, into more thematic analyses for these media articles. But beyond that, beyond the media data collection, we've also gathered articles on homelessness, housing precarity, and disasters, which there's really not a lot out there. We've found white papers that we can include, but we're pulling out key recommendations and key findings from the research and compiling it. And what we want to do as a next step for that is pull out key recommendations into a document that's not only that's applicable for future research directions to an extent, but mostly what could we pull from this that could be practically useful. And that's what we're engaging in. That's what we're doing right now.
So it sounds like the project is evolving, which makes sense at this point. Do you have an expected duration for the project?
Well, so for this project, the next step would be we want to acquire funding. Obviously, that would be great to acquire funding that would allow us to do some more applied work that we're all interested in doing. Again, not that it's not important for us to integrate theoretical perspectives. We definitely want to build theory, but we really want to look for outlets that would enable us to engage and with practitioners and engage in more applied work, it being more of a co-production of knowledge. And in terms of the working group itself, since it's evolving more into a network, we see this being long-term. We want this to be an established network, so this won't come to an end anytime in the near future. This is something we want to sustain. So I don't know if that partially answers your question, but in terms of a timeline for this for COVID-19 related work, next steps would be to acquire funding, and the duration of that at this point is unknown.
So you've already mentioned that you're collaborating with others on the project. Are these existing collaborations or are they new?
Some of them are existing collaborations, and by collaborations, I mean people that I've had conversations with in the past about issues around homelessness and disasters, such as Mark Sedembrino and June Jen and J.C. Gaillard. But we have engaged a number of people with new perspectives from various contexts. That's been probably one of the most rewarding aspects of this work, is getting to know people doing incredible work in practice and in research on these topics. So I don't know if you wanted me to provide more specific examples, but we've definitely broadened the number of practitioners in different contexts, because while I had connections in Boulder County, I guess my framing was limited in that sense, in the very unique context that is Boulder County. So now we have folks from Florida, and we're trying to engage with others in the United States and beyond, but that's been definitely, that's where the new perspectives have come in for sure, is the engagement of practitioners.
So is there a specific example that you'd like to share with respect to a collaboration that might have resulted in something that you hadn't expected?
Let me think about that. Something I haven't expected. I'm trying to think about really what we gleaned from the panel that we put together for the Natural Hazards Workshop, and that really, I wouldn't say that it was unexpected. It was more of a fruitful experience, a really rewarding experience to have the panelists that we were able to, that JC and I, we co-moderated the panel, and we were able to gain perspectives from folks who have who worked in different contexts. So we had someone based in the UK, another based in New Zealand. We had a practitioner, a director of a homeless serving organization in Dallas, Texas. And so I think more than anything, that wasn't necessarily a surprising, what we gleaned from that wasn't surprising. It was just more of a, really showed the value of and why it's important to have these perspectives, and that we don't work in our silos, and that we don't, as researchers, just engage practitioners and then, by collecting data and then leaving. We've seen that the actual value of having practitioners working alongside you throughout the process. And I think that panel was really indicative of that, because we split it up pretty equally based on those who are engaged in research, those who are engaged in practice. So that's an interesting question, but I can't say that it was surprising necessarily. It was just really showing how important it is more than anything.
Mm-hmm. In the event that you were to acquire some funding, as you're hoping to do, what would be the methods of data collection, sort of the research design that you would have in mind?
Well, initially, what we're thinking is we would love to do interviews, whether that's in the form of focus group interviews or one-on-one interviews with key stakeholders, policymakers, those in the practice space in particular, working on issues around homelessness and housing precarity, and understanding their responses to COVID-19 and what's evolving in various contexts. We'd love to do an international study by pinpointing like key decision makers, key practitioners, and that would really enable us. What we first and foremost have to do, though, is broaden our network before we're able to do that, because we want to make sure that these individuals, that we're not only engaging them in terms of data collection, but see how they'd like to be involved in the network even throughout, like what they would like their level of involvement to be. But I envision, and we've talked about this, and again, this is still in the planning stages, but that seems like the next step that would make the most sense after we're able to conduct secondary data analysis and content analysis of these articles, is to then engage people who are in these key decision-making roles and key practitioner positions.
So going back to the concept that you used in your dissertation, right, the pressure and release, that model,
mm-hmm.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that? And I know this isn't a dissertation grilling or anything, but if you could share, that would be helpful.
So a little bit more about what that entails, broadly speaking? Okay. So what, and this is exactly what we're discussing in the focus in the working group / network as well, are first and foremost understanding, how did we get to this point? Even before COVID-19, why does homelessness exist? And that was a question that we really spent the first few weeks of our the meetings that we had as a working group in understanding, because before we can understand what the effects of COVID-19 are on these populations, on these communities, we needed to have an understanding of why we're here in the first place and how homelessness is socially created. And so that pressure and release model is also a useful framing for digging deeper into the why, into the causality of why homelessness exists. And so we used that framework was, in my dissertation, I used it to understand the experiences of the flood experiences of the homeless community in Boulder County and homeless serving organizations. But really, it was useful just to look at and use as a way of framing homelessness as a social problem, and really teasing apart the why there. And obviously, it's dependent on context. So that filled a lot of our discussions for, why is homelessness, let's talk about homelessness in the U.S. Let's talk about homelessness in this context. I mean, it was primarily, given that our group is made up of folks primarily from the U.S., a lot of our discussions centered there, admittedly. And so we talked about what is currently in place that keeps people in precarious housing situations. We talked about income inequality. We talked about the eviction crisis. And so what this model helped us to do was to understand, as I mentioned, without being too repetitive, what is the framework what is the framing, the discourse that's used to justify homelessness and that leads to homelessness. And in the U.S., we talked about neoliberal regimes and neoliberal governance, and how if you don't participate in the market economy, then you're really not considered a useful member of society. And that's one of the reasons that leads to the stigma surrounding homelessness and what keeps people who are experiencing homelessness in a rut, so to speak. So we talked about broader level issues that influence some of these other key processes, such as homeless criminalization and what's led to the housing crisis in the U.S. and how that intersects with COVID-19. So I don't know if that is clear enough, but that's certainly how we were viewing it as a group and how we integrated that model.
That's very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you anticipate to be or are the challenges of doing your research in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic?
I think I'm guessing this will be similar to other folks that you speak to, but in being able to talk to people, obviously we have Zoom functionality, we have Zoom, we can call people to ask, maybe have telephone interviews or focus group interviews using Zoom, but we constantly have to ask, who does that leave out, and who are we unable to reach given this current, given the current crisis that we're in. So while we can reach certain communities, certain organizations that we either have pre-existing connections with or who are well-resourced enough to take the time to speak with us, because not every organization has that, has the ability to drop and meet with us for an hour or two to discuss some of these challenges they're experiencing. So understanding that, and also, just putting it out there, how do we engage with people who are experiencing homelessness right now? Obviously, they have limited access to the type of technology that could afford, that would enable them to participate. On top of, even if we weren't even in this particular context, it's already quite challenging, or at least there's special considerations that one has to take when they're engaging with homeless communities in a respectful way. So the fact that a lot of what we have to do is virtual or over the phone is an added dimension on top of that. So I know that it's probably similar with other groups, but especially given that this is already such a hard to reach population, it makes it all the more challenging. And we want to make sure that their perspectives are represented. And so we've been thinking through how to do that. And one way, and this was shared during our panel presentation at the Natural Hazards Workshop, we had a couple of, like I said, couple of practitioners who were able to explain to their clients what they were doing on this particular panel and the work that they're involved in with the working group, and asked them if they would feel comfortable sharing their perspectives or quotes or insights around very general questions about how COVID-19 has affected them. So that's not ideal, but that's one way that we've been able to at least glean some experiences, even though it's anecdotal, but some of the experiences of those who are experiencing housing precarity at this time. And so the organizations have been absolutely critical in that regard. They've been a key facilitator for us in understanding what's really happening with these communities, with these individuals. So we'll probably continue to go that direction, because at this point it's hard to envision another format.
Thank you. So much like everyone else, we expect that your day-to-day life is probably being affected by the pandemic. Would you mind to share some of your personal experiences with respect to your own personal life that are affecting the way you go about your research and your professional life?
Yes. Well, I'm sharing a space with my husband, and while we can work in different rooms, sometimes the internet's spotty. So logistically, sometimes the internet's spotty, sometimes we both have meetings at the same time, and it's distracting. Again, that's not surprising. I know several people, many people are experiencing the same issue. But for me, on a personal level, something that's also been affecting me in my day-to-day is that I, especially early on, kept asking myself, what can I do? What can I do? I feel helpless right now. And the working group was one way for me to have an outlet to discuss what I can do, given my expertise, my experience, the connections that I'm forming with these other individuals, to actually hopefully make a difference and at least aid the organizations serving these communities. But for me, I'm just, in a time like this, if this were a different disaster context, like the floods, I would see how I can volunteer, or how I can go through training to volunteer at these organizations, and I can't do that right now. So personally, that's been a challenge, because I want to be heavily involved, and that's really important for me, not only personally, but for how I engage in research, is having that in-depth understanding, being there on the ground, being in these organizations and helping as a volunteer, and I can't do that because we're not allowed to volunteer, obviously, right now, given the situation. So I have felt at times a little hopeless in that sense, but being able to have this group really has alleviated some of those feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, I guess I should say, more than hopelessness. So that's been a challenge, and it still is a challenge, but I'm feeling better about what we can do as a group. And I know that sounds very self-serving in a way, but I still, that's what's so important to me in my research, is that I understand fully the problem that these communities are facing, that these organizations are facing, and a way for me to do that is to be fully engaged in any way that I can. So.
Do you have any sense that the homeless serving organizations are being challenged in and of themselves by people coming who didn't used to need the services that they're providing?
Yeah, so I'm speaking from right now. I can speak from a couple different contexts based on what I've heard, but in Boulder County, it's interesting because there's already a debate, and this isn't unique to Boulder County, but there's been efforts to stop the amount of services provided even before COVID-19, because they think there's some community members who feel that attracts more people and that attracts people experiencing homelessness. And so they see that as a problem. And so one of the ways that communities are talking about this, and again, I don't want to speak generally, but is that we need to reduce the number of services. So that was already kind of underway in Boulder County before COVID-19. And so there have been, based on the conversations that I've had with folks who work in Boulder County, they feel that there's been maybe a slight uptick in the amount of people reaching out for services, but that given that it's the summer months right now, it's a very unique time of year because people camp outside. A lot of people camp outside. They're waiting. It's yet to be seen, especially in the coming months, what the effects will be, because then they'll really get to see the range of people who will be coming in for services once the weather turns colder. So it's the seasonal aspect. And let's see, in Florida, we have someone in the Jacksonville area who they're describing that they've had more negative experiences comparatively, in the sense that there's been higher rates of infection within the homeless community that hasn't been seen in Boulder County, and so they've definitely experienced not only an uptick in requests for services, but having to adapt more so to the health-related needs of their clients compared to Boulder County. Because thankfully, there hasn't been as many, very, very little cases of COVID-19 in the homeless community that has been reported in Boulder County compared to the Jacksonville homeless serving organization that I'm speaking of. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what they've told us thus far, is how it's affecting them. Some of them seem like they have to adapt more than others, and I think a lot of that obviously has to do with the context, the geographic context as well.
In terms of your professional logistics, I know that you typically work from home. How, if at all, has the pandemic caused you to adjust, or is everything pretty much the same as it used to be for you?
Everything's pretty much the same, to be honest. I think the major difference is having another person in the space. I've gotten quite used to, and maybe some would say spoiled, to having the flexibility with my schedule, to be able to, if I need to run, how it was before, if I needed to run an errand in the morning, I could make up the work in the evening, and I didn't work a typical 9 to 5, or how some people work in that schedule. So with Brock working from home and him having that 9 to 5 or 8 to 5 schedule, it's caused me to have to adjust when I work quite a bit. So that would be the major difference. It's not so much that I'm not used to managing my own time and working from home and not being in a space where I'm with colleagues. That hasn't changed, but really when I get my work done and when I can focus, that's adapted. That's had to adapt based on him also working in the same space.
Thank you. I have one more question for you, and that has to do with the Black Lives Matter movement. What are the consequences of that movement, if any, and the demonstrations in particular following the killing of George Floyd?
It's had major implications on me personally and on the work that I do. Admittedly, you know, when I was engaged in doing research on homelessness and disasters before this, I of course understood that that homelessness in and of itself is racialized, housing precarity is racialized, and that there are different experiences among those among homeless communities based on gender, based on race, and a number of other factors, language spoken. So I knew that going in. But really, what these movements and has really inspired me and changed the way that I view my work. I think especially this had to do with maybe the position that I was in as a student and then as a postdoc, where I felt like I was in a bit of an unstable position. I felt as though I shouldn't engage in work or I shouldn't frame my work in a politically charged way. I thought that, oh, that might hurt me. I mean, I'm just speaking truthfully here, that might hurt me, and that I need to be careful about how I frame certain arguments and the language that I use. But really, this has been pivotal for me in my personal life, affecting the ways that I've engaged, and just in some cases stopped engaging with certain people in my life, based on beliefs that don't align with mine and values that don't align with mine, around Black Lives Matter. And this has also prompted me to really, really take to heart what my values are and how this colors my personal life, but also the work that I do as a researcher. So it's had monumental effects on me, and it's caused me to be more, I guess, how I would previously have phrased it, be more politically motivated in my work, because it is political. There are aspects, obviously, of research that I engage in where I am supposed to be as objective as possible, and I am. But there are cases such as this where, especially coming from a sociological background, I think about the role of sociology and the foundations of sociology, and it's really, really caused me to assess that more deeply and think about what I can do in my role and the privilege that I have, the education, the experiences that I've had in engaging in work that, you know, with the ultimate goal of dismantling white supremacy. I know that's a lot, but it really has affected me. I mean, and as I don't know if this is relevant to include here, but it actually led me to me and a colleague to decide not to engage in a research proposal with someone because of their lack of, they felt that the work that they did, because they were in a physical science space, didn't apply to the needs of communities on the ground, and that they really didn't need to think about at-risk communities, and because they didn't think that their work directly applied to that. And it was a hard decision, a hard conversation, but it was really an act for both of us to put our values into practice and say, you know what, we can't do this. If you don't understand the importance of ways in which research, it doesn't matter if you're a social scientist, if you're a geologist, hydrologist, atmospheric scientist, you need to understand the societal impacts of your work and how your work can contribute, or, you know, and what it can do to either exacerbate inequalities or alleviate inequalities. And that was an example of how trying to put that into action.
Wow, that's really where the rubber meets the road. Very, very interesting that you took that stance at your own expense, probably.
Yeah, it was hard, but you know, the way that I see it is, there's a reason why I entered this space. There's a reason why I decided to get a sociology degree, and ultimately, as corny as it sounds, I want to make the world a better place, even if it's in a small way. And just going back to what I wanted to do as a 5-year-old, making the world a better place. How can I do that, and which values I cannot compromise? And so it's really been the experience of living in this political moment has pushed me that direction, and I'm thankful for it. It's not to say it's been easy, but I'm very thankful for it and recognize the unique privilege that I have.
Well, those are all of the formal questions that I have at this point. Is there anything that you think of that you might want to share that's relevant to this research project in particular that we're working on, or something else relative to your own research at this point?
So I don't really have anything. I guess mostly what I have to add is just onto the last question, and that I think it's incredibly important for researchers in general. It's more of a statement, and just my own thinking through all this is really not just given this political moment, but even if this political moment inspires people to think this way, that's great. But I'm just wondering, this is more of a question, but I'm wondering how much this is going to affect others who work in spaces where they previously thought their own research wasn't, couldn't be touched politically or shouldn't be touched politically. How that's changed, how that may have changed mindsets, because now more than ever I just see the political. I see the importance of using this lens, of using an intersectional lens, especially in the work that I do, and I just wonder if this is going to be a moment or if this is going to be more of a movement, a long-term movement, and how people engage in research on various fronts. But again, that's more of a comment question, not so much in addition to what you asked.
Well, that's totally allowed.
Yeah.
Well, I don't have anything else for you. I'll stop recording at this point and say our farewells as we see fit. Give me just a second.